Fitz, how are you?
What's my name, Ray? What's my name?
Jim Fitzgerald.
Thank you. It's great to be with you, Ray, and our two guests tonight. And, Ray, you and I have been doing some media work. We've been certainly on different shows. We've talked about it here, about the Nancy Guthrie case. If you've even a little bit of interest in that case, you're going to love our show tonight because today we actually are diving into a case that has a massive wealth and a high society disappearance and a trail that went cold nearly 50 years ago. We're talking about the candy heiress, Helen Brock.
You know, to understand what happened to Helen on that day, February in 1977, you have to understand who she was. So we'd like to talk a little bit about the victimology in this case and let the world see through her eyes and the eyes whoever may have been watching her.
And to do that, we brought in two people who have lived and breathed this case for the last several years. And full disclosure, you're about to meet John Rocks and Beth McNamara. I'm friends with both of them. John is a fellow member of the VDOC Society, along with me and Ray. And they're now the host of the podcast, What Happened to the Candy Heiress? And that, of course, is Jonathan Rocks and Beth McNamara. So to both of you, welcome to Cold Red.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
You know, John and Beth, you've talked to a lot of witnesses. You dug through the archives, and you felt the atmosphere of that scene in Chicago in the 1970s. Tell us a little bit about that.
Go ahead, John.
Well, we were sort of starting fresh on this case. Neither of us are from Chicago. And Beth and I have talked about this a lot. I think sometimes not being from the city that the case happened in can help, because you don't have any preconceived notions of who you should talk to or shouldn't talk to or what you should think or not think. And I think that's where we started. We really started as complete novice investigators on this case.
It seemed like everybody was sort of regurgitating what they already knew. And for us, we never sort of take what is adjudicated or decided as that's the word. And we just kept digging. And the more we kept digging, the more we kept digging. And then we wanted to talk to everybody we want.
And if I could just say up front, Beth is a veteran of podcasting. And I think it's one of maybe only the second podcast, true crime podcast I ever listened to after Serial, kind of the granddaddy of them all. And that's one, and the official name, it's about the Move organization in Philadelphia. What's the official name of the podcast, Beth?
Murder at Ryan's Run.
Yes. And we're not going to get into that tonight, maybe for another Cold Red episode. But it's a fascinating look into this allegedly back to Earth organization that's been in Philadelphia since the 70s. They're still there now. My friend, firefighter John Welsh, who's the brother of Joe Welsh, who was murdered, we talked about a few episodes ago. He was shot in the first confrontation. Beth did a great job on that. So as soon as I heard she would be involved with crime from the Candy Heiress case, I knew it would be an excellent podcast. And I've listened to all the podcasts so far. And folks, I would suggest you start listening too, because if you're interested at all, like I said, you're going to be interested in Helen Brock and what she went through. There's some differences, but there's some the same too, including that you're kind of looking for facts and information about this. So, John, we talked about at the first VDOC meeting, then we used to meet at the Starbucks, and you had a few different cases. And we both agreed this one about Helen Brock would be the most compelling for documentary, series, podcast, podcast, with all kinds of options open to that. But walk us through a little bit of the crime and at least some of the players involved to give our audience a taste of what was going on back in 1977.
Well, Helen married into the Brock family, which is the Brock's Candy Company. So she wasn't a Brock from birth. She's from rural Ohio. And I think that one of the things about the case that's interesting is that we've said this before, it's almost like a game of Clue, because she goes missing, there's no crime scene, there's no blood, very little leads, apparently. But there are a few different characters that kind of fit archetypes. There's the houseman, who's essentially a butler. There's the gigolo, who's something of a boyfriend. Then there's a group called the Horse Mafia, which is a version of a mafia that's more of a rural local gang. And they're all somehow mixed into whatever it is that happened to Helen. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're from Chicago, a lot of times what happens is you have a dyed-in-the-wool idea of what happened because of the coverage. Just like you mentioned, Move. I'm from Philadelphia. People here have an opinion almost from birth. With this case, I think the idea was that we approached it with fresh eyes. We wanted to look at it completely with no preconceived notions. And I think Beth would agree. We only do this sort of thing if we can get to the root of getting documents, getting interviews with people that were involved, getting original audio and things like that. And over, I think it's been about 4 years now, we've been able to do that through Beth's skills as a cold caller, which is not my strong suit, through FOIA requests that resulted in documents, and through sort of white knuckling a search for the things that have always been there but were never looked at deeply in this case.
And that's exactly what they did. I've been listening to a number of those episodes, and actually I listened to a lot of these interviews in the early days, John, at his request, and trying to add some behavioral components to it. We can talk about that a little bit later, but it is amazing. John comes from a long family, multiple family members at the local and state and federal level, and well, he may not be an official investigator. He's done some damn good investigation in this case, and he's uncovered some facts that many people didn't know in the past. And of course, Beth, you came in as a co-producer, co-narrator, what have you, and you had a lot to talk. So yeah, so this is just such a strange case, and we were asked to talk about the risk level of Mrs. Brock, who was a widow in 1977, worth, and through the podcast, John, you've given us the financial amount. What was she worth then, and what would it be worth now in today's money?
The estimate was that she was worth about $21 million when she disappeared. In today's money, that's over $100 million, about $110, $111 million. And one of the interesting things about it is she was, as you mentioned, a widow. She had no children, relatively small family. The money has only grown since then. So her estate has grown quite a bit since she passed, since she went missing. So that's one of the interesting things about the case, because in a cold case where no one knows what happened, technically, the one thing that is left is her estate, her money, and that sort of is where if you reverse engineer the story, that might be the first place you start looking, which is where's the money, and if you trace that back to when she went missing, does that tell you anything different?
Beth, I think you're muted. And number two, do you have two Riverside apps open? You're still muted, Beth. Beth, you're still muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Now I can.
Okay. Echo?
Okay. Our producer just said that there may be two, and we can edit this out down the road, but there may be two apps open on your end.
Oh, let's see.
If you can see it.
Now you're not echoing.
Yep, that was it.
Okay.
Can you hear me
Well-
okay? I'm so sorry. Now you're going to have to edit.
Like Jim, I've had the opportunity to listen to some of your episodes. And I look at this as, and kind of frame it around the fact that it appears to me that it may have been a financially motivated, planned, no homicide, no body homicide, tied to an existing fraud network, which you mentioned earlier, John, with a likely small group of offenders who have had prior experience involving cover-ups and possibly witness intimidation. It just appears to me that there seems to this is not their first rodeo, in other words, because it was just too clean. You're still muted, Beth.
You should hear the debates that John and I get into over this. I mean, they are fast and furious and long and regular, because I think financial motivation can run on a spectrum. You know, it can be a conspiracy, or it can be something as simple as between two individuals. And there's a lot more to be revealed as that goes on.
That's the tricky part here, which is like trying to discuss this without giving away sort of where our thesis lands by the end.
And we respect that. We absolutely do. But I think the first several episodes out now, I want to sort of lay the groundwork for that and just say, you know, going back almost 50 years, it's just such an interesting aspect of our country's history, of our culture. And you know, all of us were around then. I guess it was my first year in law enforcement as a police officer, but I don't remember a whole lot of publicity. Obviously, it's decades before the internet, and I'm sure there was something in the headlines about missing candy errors. And if you can picture, I think one of the articles, those little hearts you buy every Valentine's Day, well, that's her company. And of course, it was founded by her husband. He died only a few years before. But then it just kind of goes quiet. And then John talking to you, this thing has taken on several lives over the years with several different protagonists, if you will, or perhaps antagonists, better word, in terms of who could be responsible for this. And like you said, between people dating her, between people taking care of the house, between this horse mafia. I never heard of a horse mafia before this case. But you got some interesting characters in there, and the case has so many compelling parts to it. And I'm not even sure at this point, having talked to you before, if I know the actual ending to this. And in 49 years it happened. And I know we're going to finally get the final episode here and get some of those answers before. So yeah, this is an amazing case. And you guys have done great work in these first four episodes that I've listened to.
So for anyone that doesn't know that's listening, the case revolves around Helen's disappearance. So as you mentioned, she was a very wealthy woman. She married into an iconic brand family. In 1977, she takes a trip to the Mayo Clinic to get a week-long physical, let's say. It's up in the air whether or not she ever returned from the Mayo Clinic. Some theorize that she was picked up there in a car. Some theorize she flew home. But whatever the case may be, the only person that after she left the Mayo Clinic would ever say that he had seen her again was her houseman. He claimed that she came home the weekend of the 17th, remained at the house in Glenview, Illinois, and then left for Florida the following Monday. And there's no one that can back up the story, but there's not necessarily anybody that can refute it either, which is what's very frustrating. After she leaves, according to the houseman, It's about 2 weeks before anyone is told that she's missing. Now, the difficult part about that is the intervening 2 weeks, he spent doing things that make him look nothing but suspicious. He had the car detailed. He had walls painted in the house, baseboards replaced, any number of things that typically make one look a little suspicious. We've talked about this in the past, Jim. Just because it looks suspicious doesn't mean it is. But after 4 years looking into this, one thing I'll tell you, nothing we've ever found has gotten less interesting about the case. Nothing has made it easier to sort of swallow as a cold case. It's only gotten more and more interesting. And primarily, the question that we've had is, maybe we're not, but why are we the first ones to ask the sort of questions we are about this case? As I said, we did a FOIA request. We've reached out to people who were willing to talk to us. For the very first time, we have Helen's family taking part in the podcast, which is a big thing for us because they've never spoken publicly, and if anyone deserves answers about the case, it's her family. So it's the sort of thing where, as you mentioned, there hasn't been as much publicity around the case, especially lately, as I would hope. But it's a brand that's still visible all year round. And I'm surprised there hasn't been more eyes and ears before Beth and I looked into it the way we have.
Beth, any follow-up to that?
I think we've been having a lot of fun with the podcast. We have a Substack. I don't know if you guys have checked it out. And we've been doing these posts like every time we introduce a new character, then we ask people, who would you cast in the movie? Which is kind of fun. Because we've, in our mind, have cast it. And the other thing we're really examining in the podcast is the role of the media in the public's perception of an unsolved case. That they can then, some of them think like it was already completely solved because of headlines, because of takes people had. And we're sort of taking it all apart and laying it out and leaving it back together. Which has been really interesting. We've really enjoyed those conversations with journalists.
When I look at this and listening to some of the things you're saying, I always ask the question, no matter if it's 50 years old or 60 years old or 10 years old or happened last week, why was this victim chosen at this particular point in time? Were they specifically selected or was it random? And when I look at her, she's a high value target. She has substantial assets. There's no protective guards or entourage. And she's involved in a recent history of being defrauded. And she was openly threatening to go to the authorities, which in my estimation elevates her risk of being the victim of a crime. Go ahead.
The episode we're dropping tomorrow addresses that. Because you could hear that something is the case and it might not be the case.
So I'll have to wait till tomorrow before we can get the answer to that.
Yes.
Is that what you're telling me, Beth?
Yes.
Okay.
It's weird. As Jim mentioned, I come from a police family, a law enforcement family. So it's in my blood to sort of assume if someone's arrested or someone's convicted, it's the case. With this, just like you're saying about Helen, she was sort of the victim of circumstance. I think there's something to that with regard to the person that was convicted who would have indicated that the case was closed when he was convicted. What I can say is there's a reason the case has never been officially closed, despite the fact that somebody went to prison for the crime. It's still open. And that's what keeps us going. We hold up and looked at the result, the solution to the case. and we had questions. And I think the answers that we got, and more importantly, the answers we didn't get, made us even more confident in what we're doing. We're sort of just trying to lay it out there. We've said between Beth and I, I'm happy to be proven wrong. I'm hoping that as Beth said, laying out the entire case and looking through it very closely, maybe some information will come to the front, or maybe some people that hear the podcast who have information could maybe prove us wrong and show us where something we may have missed. We remain open to that. But until that point, I think we're pretty confident in where we're coming down on the result of the case.
And I can tell you from my experience in this case, going back maybe 2.5 years now with John, that no stone has been left unturned by John and Beth. Some other entities out there perhaps could have turned some stones over, and they didn't over the past 5 decades, or at least almost 5 complete decades. So it is frustrating in those ways. But as I've said before, Ray, and you know this as well as anyone, sometimes cases, they can be a lot tougher to solve in the first 10 weeks than they are 10 years or even 20 years, sometimes even 50 years later. Now, of course, the advent of DNA technology and genealogical, familial DNA, that changes things. I'm not sure if that could ever play a role in this. We would need a body first, which of course it's no secret in this case we don't have that. But that would that could certainly help shed some light on this. But just to go back to the very basic profiling aspects of this case, and we talked about it a little bit earlier. On the whole, through her overall lifestyle, I would call Mrs. Brock a low risk victim. And when we look at those things from a behavioral perspective, the high risk are, of course, prostitutes and drug users and people, getting highly promiscuous women or men strung out on drugs all the time. They're going to be high risk victims. This woman's her everyday lifestyle was very much low risk in a nice area, in a nice home. Relatively well protected, even if not with security people per se. But the fact, of course, that she was worth over $100 million in today's money, arguably that raised her risk victim, her risk level, and potential victimization, and it's something she had no control over. She couldn't control how much money she did or didn't have in her various accounts. So you could look back and say that made her high risk, although it was nothing that she was doing on a daily, weekly, or even yearly basis. So, and what it also tells you about our offender or offenders, plural, I like the term, if in fact is appropriate, that they were mission oriented, and obviously successful. And down the line, not so much tonight's podcast, but certainly listening to the Helen Brock Missing Candy Heirs podcast, you'll learn where some of this money wound up, and you have to ask yourself, what did all that mean, and how did it wind up getting there? And was that all part of a master plan or not? But again, it's victimization is important. And I don't think, and you can correct me, but I don't think she was ever victimized before of any type of violent crime, any kind of assault, anything like that. And here all of a sudden, a trip out of state, and she may or may not have come back from, and conflicting stories who saw her last. One person who saw her last, but after that it gets a little bit iffy. So there are just so many interesting components to this, from this low risk victim who wound up only because of her financial status, and unbeknownst to her, then became a high risk victim. And unfortunately, almost 50 years later, she she's not with us, and she probably hasn't been for most of those almost 50 years.
John, go ahead, Beth.
I think also what's really interesting about this story is, you've got this Candy heiress, and then if you look at the suspects, which have become our episodes, you've got the house band, the horse mafia. Tomorrow we're dropping the golden tongue. Then we've got a con man coming up, and it sounds like a movie. And all of these characters plug in at different points on the timeline. But ultimately, as the only woman on the interview screen, women in general are subject to violence every day.
Mhm.
And if you were around a violent person, you could end up dead. And I think about she was 65 years old. The only person in the house with her was 20 years younger. And he had a history of violence towards women.
That's one of the things that I think. Look, I remain respectful of investigators in that we have the latitude to devote all of our time to this investigation. Cold case units, active police officers, and investigators, they don't necessarily. So it's not as though we're doing anything better or rectifying something that was done wrong. But with the ability to look so closely into some of the people who are suspects here, you do find out things like what Beth just mentioned. The house band had a long and detailed history of violence. That's never truly been a part of this story before. That, in my opinion, sheds a lot of light onto, like Beth said, the house that Helen was living in. I mean, looking back from where I stand now, she was around a violent man every single day, and that's not really been part of the story. Her house band has been painted as a someone that was trying to find her and called and let people know she was missing and all that. But his story is a lot deeper than's been reported. But that goes for almost every suspect in this case. That's why I say it never gets any less interesting. You turn to someone like the Golden Tongue, Richard Bailey. Not a good guy, but interesting to no end. I mean, the guy, we spoke to him many times, and again, it was never a boring call. And there was more information between every time we spoke to him. The same goes for Helen's family. Same goes for everyone who was willing to speak to us. And on some level, people that weren't willing to speak to us told us just as much. The people that denied the ability to speak to us or didn't want to even take our call. A lot of times that tells you more, more than they would have told you if they took the call. And I'll leave it at that.
And I listened to a number of the tapes of Richard Bailey. And how old was he in his early 90s when you were interviewing him?
Mm-hmm.
And he described himself as a ladies' man. And Beth, wasn't he kind of hitting on you?
Yes, and it was very flattering.
Well, I hope when Ray and I are 90 years old, we can have his, the same kind of thoughts and processes that he has. Right, Ray?
Absolutely. Hey, John, if you could check your AirPod connection to make sure it's connected. I just want to say, I know John talked about earlier on about a trip to the Mayo Clinic for some medical tests that she took. And then there was supposedly some legitimate travel that they could neither prove nor disprove to Florida. And I don't know if you guys have mentioned this yet, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a delay in reporting of her missing. Was there not?
Yes. So the houseman doesn't report her missing to police until 2 weeks later. But then he can't file the actual missing persons report because he's not next of kin or family. So he has the brother travels to Ohio. and
Yeah.
make the report.
Yeah.
What a convenient 2 weeks to have.
Correct. Well, that leads to what John talked about. There was a lot of behavior to me that are red flags that this individual engaged in, like house cleaning. I think there was some forged checks that were
Lots
not
of
in his
forged
handwriting, right? And there was something when I looked and looking into the background of this, there was mention of an industrial site with a furnace. Do they believe in? I don't want to jump the gun with you guys here. Am I jumping the gun?
Well, what's interesting is that there's the investigative files, and then there's the RICO case. And the RICO case, investigative files are based on facts and evidence and
Right.
information you gather. The RICO case is a narrative. And just like
Really?
John and I have a narrative for the podcast. And it's very interesting. We've read everything we can get our hands on. And to try and then explain what is the law, what is RICO, and what is the narrative, and then what the media is reporting, and then what sticks is very interesting.
Well, the RICO case is what sentenced him to 30 years in prison, correct?
The golden tongue, yes.
Right. That's what sentenced him to 30 years. So that in itself is based upon facts and evidence, the RICO case.
RICO cases are preponderance.
I don't think so. At least not in my estimation. In working RICO cases in the bureau. Wow, a big echo there. But anyways, I've worked several RICO cases, and was never preponderance of the evidence. The civil cases are preponderance of the evidence. It's beyond a reasonable doubt in RICO case, because you have to prove that in federal court, because you have to prove two predicate acts. You got to prove not just the conspiracy aspect of it, but there's got to be violence also proven with that in order to make a RICO run. And that's just for our RICO is a racketeering, it's a racketeering case against corrupt organizations.
Racketeering, influence, corrupt organizations is what it stands for.
Right.
Came out in the late 70s, basically to fight organized crime, but it can be used in other ways. As Ray just, I don't think you two are really contradicting each other. There's still evidence needed. There's just other ways of looking at it from sort of an umbrella perspective, as opposed to specific individual acts besides the two predicate acts that have to be determined. Okay. So John said this earlier. Here we have a guy that did 30 years under RICO violations involving the disappearance of Helen Brock, but the case remains open. And her body has never been found. No one's been charged with her murder. It's a RICO aspect of it. And you guys interviewed Richard Bailey. And it just, he is a silver-tongued devil or angel, however he wants to call himself, in terms of how he responds to some of your questions. And I think the fans, the audience, will be very much interested in hearing this guy. I found him fascinating in sort of a unusual way, but nonetheless, he added a lot to this case. And he besides the house man, remind me, he's the last person to see Helen Brock live? Well, at least in her house, correct, John?
The houseman, his story depends on what you believe. He says he picked her up from the airport, brought her home, and she spent the weekend at home, and then he brought her back to the airport and she left. But no one heard from her. She was a phone-aholic, according to him. No one had a phone call from her. No one saw her physically. No one heard from her at all. Only him. So he's the only person from the moment she left the Mayo Clinic that has ever claimed to have seen her in a meaningful way.
That's right. Yet he was her boyfriend for a year or two prior. to her disappearance?
Well, there's the houseman and then there's Bailey. Bailey
Right,
is
that's
the
right,
sort of the gigolo.
Yeah. Okay.
When she went missing, he was in Florida.
Okay. There's a lot of players. I'm losing track sometimes of exactly who fit in there when. But it's an interesting case with interesting people. And hearing from Helen Brock's family, certainly me for the first time in the audience, and there's tapes you have from back in the day, but certainly current ones also. It's fascinating, and to hear them talking about an aunt or a family member or even sibling, I believe, of this person they haven't seen in almost 50 years. And sometimes they don't want to deal with this, and they go years without talking to people. But John, luckily, you approach them the right way. I won't even say luckily, but you skillfully approach them the right way, and they know you're serious about this presentation, this investigation, and you're trying to get it done right.
I think what happens is we've taken a victim-centered focus. And the family, that was one of their main concerns, is that they didn't want it to be something salacious. They didn't want it to be something that they would regret taking part in. And when we were able to meet with them over several phone calls and meet in person, I was glad to see that they could see what we were trying to do, which is just get to the bottom of what actually happened. Try to get an answer in a meaningful way again.
You've done a great job of that so far.
Yeah, I hope people give it a listen. It's a very complicated case, and we boiled it down to a tight 7 episodes. And I think that for people that know the case, or people that don't know the case, there's going to be a lot to take away from this story, because we've really kind of held every bit of it up to the light. And I think we've come up with some new information that would be interesting.
But you're not able to talk about that, John? Or is that something that's going to come out?
There are a few things that we're holding just so that the focus remains on the contiguous story that we're telling. So in other words, we've done it mostly in order. So by the time we get to the last episode or two, we actually catch up with Beth and I in Chicago and take the story from there. We did visit Glenview. We've been all through Helen's home. We met with the Glenview police, so there's sort of a contemporaneous aspect to the end of the season.
I guess we lost Beth. I guess maybe she's mad at me or something, John. She texted me.
She got kicked off.
Well,
she got kicked off. Okay.
Yeah, I'm looking at some messages here. Apparently, there's some bad echoing going on, and this has never happened to us before.
Yeah, no.
I don't know what kicked in here, and this would definitely, because we're putting this out live, and then of course, but you said Matt was hearing it just fine.
Yeah, it's on his end. He's hearing it fine. Yeah, I've heard a little bit echoes too. So
we can cut this part out before we drop it. So folks out there apologizing.
Oh, no, he's gone.
Now we lost John.
So
I don't know what went wrong here with the echoing. I don't know if we're still live. So
well, apparently we are still live, Jim.
Yeah. Okay.
But Jim, I look, when I look at how this kind of plays out, and I guess we can talk, because I felt like we couldn't say much, because every time we said something, it was kind of leading into what they wanted to talk to.
And I respect that. I respect that.
Yeah, I didn't know that coming in, but it looks like when you look at the behavior, it was broken down. It looks like they had some sort of inside information with access to the residents, just to be able to do things. And I think that the decision maker was the person involved, this Bailey, who was involved and indicted in the RICO. And I think they had a couple muscle actors. So I think there was a group of people. The muscle actors are actually the ones that abducted, assaulted her, and disposed of her. I don't think she's alive. I think it's, not finding the body, I don't think is a really, really good thing. And Matlick, who was her butler or friend, his type of behavior was really inconsistent with his travel story, or unusual morning flight, the cleaning, the car detailing, the burning in the dairy. He had some financial benefits to it as well. These are classic post-offense behavior things that someone with at least knowledge, if not direct involvement, was involved in. We're just, as you came on, just back on, John, we're just talking a little bit about Matlick and how he somehow, some way, he's got to be tied into this.
That's what Beth wasn't lying when she said we've had some serious discussions about whether or not we agree. I think we agree at the bottom of everything. We agree with what happened. I think from the point of violence, let's say, point of violence forward, we have a differing view of who was involved. But I think we both come down on the same suspect ultimately to be held responsible.
And that could be healthy in a real investigation, as well as in a investigative podcast, as you two are doing. And it's okay to kind of have your own points of view and present both of them, which certainly is what I'm hearing so far in the 4 episodes I've listened to. So I would again encourage everyone to check out this case. If Nancy Guthrie interested you at all, you're definitely going to find this interesting. You have a lot more information thanks to John and Beth in this podcast than we do in the Nancy Guthrie case. John, what's the best way to listen to the podcast?
We're on all the major streaming platforms, but if you just go to themissingcandyheiress.com, that'll take you directly to our Substack.
That's simple enough.
Yep.
Ray, any final words, and I'll take us out?
I do. If I upset Beth, I want to apologize to her there. But
not at all.
I'm clear what we were talking about, RICO. In order to bring a RICO to a head, there has to be evidence that has to be placed in court, and a jury has to find you guilty of that evidence, like they did for Bailey. However, in the sentencing of Bailey, the judge used information outside of the RICO statute that he said was a preponderance of the evidence that he believed it was more likely than not that he was involved in her disappearance. And he used that to enhance his sentence. And I think that's what Beth was talking about with this here.
I'll say two things with regard to the RICO case. It was brought against Richard Bailey and an unnamed co-conspirator. That's something that will be sort of revealed and discussed as we go forward. And as with everything that's happened in this case, Matlick was completely uninvolved with the RICO case. He wasn't called in, he wasn't interviewed, and I've never been able to figure out or understand why. He was just completely viewed as separate from the load of suspects involved here.
Sometimes when you say unnamed, it's usually unindicted co-conspirator. And Matlick could have been someone providing information in that case that left him on the outside looking in. And they protected him as a result of that. That's a very good possibility.
Very, very possible.
Mm-hmm. I've seen it happen. That's why I said that.
Yeah. Well, folks, check out Helen Brock, The Missing Candy Heiress, and all the different sites out there. And I know you will enjoy it. And John, maybe when it's completely over, we have a lot more we can talk about. We'll get you and Beth back on without some of the tech issues we've had tonight. And we'll take it from there. So everyone, thanks again for listening to this episode of Cold Red. Thanks to our producers, Matt Robinson, Matt McLaughlin. Thanks to our music coordinator, Rick Schilling. Please like us, subscribe to us, share us, check us out on coldredpodcast.com, on YouTube, everywhere you can find us. Ray, always good working with you. And everyone else out there, we will see you next time on Cold Red.